Imagine your old high school bully, and I never thought reporting a homophobic classmate's hateful posts would change my life. At first, I just wanted an apology. Instead, he lost his job, tricked me into marriage, and forced me to outsmart him in the most unexpected revenge of my life. My name is Romessa, and my ex-classmate Daniel was the kind of person who never truly left high school behind. You know the type. Smug grin, always chasing cheap laughs, and desperately trying to mask his insecurities by putting other people down. Back when we were in school, I remember the way he'd lean against the lockers, surrounded by his little circle of friends, tossing out insults like they were free candy. And of course, if you were even slightly different, you were his favorite target. It didn't matter if you dressed differently, spoke with an accent, or didn't fit into the box he thought people should live in. He would find a way to mock you. For me, Daniel's insults had a sharper edge. I wasn't out in high school, but he had this sixth sense for spotting people who didn't fit neatly into the mold. He would toss around slurs casually, sometimes directed at me, sometimes at others. He thought he was hilarious. I thought he was poison. Years passed, but unfortunately, Daniel stayed exactly the same. He wasn't just immature, he was hateful. I had moved on with my life, carving a space where I could finally be myself. I surrounded myself with friends who saw me, who supported me. I was building something worth holding on to. But then one day, I stumbled across Daniel again. This time, not in person, but through the internet. Scrolling through social media, I came across his posts. They weren't subtle. They weren't just off-color jokes. They were venom, hateful, homophobic garbage that he posted openly, like he was proud of it. He wasn't just making jokes anymore. He was doubling down on everything ugly inside of him and broadcasting it to the world. And people were reacting. Some cheered him on, others tried to argue. But there it was, evidence of exactly who he had always been. Seeing his words, I felt the same sick twist in my stomach that I used to feel walking down the hallway in high school, bracing myself for his cruelty. Only this time, it wasn't just kids in a hallway. It was out there for anyone to see. And it wasn't harmless. Words like his cut deeper than he'd ever admit. They fuel hate. They create unsafe spaces. They tell young people struggling with who they are that the world will never accept them. And I couldn't just scroll past. Not this time. At first, I didn't know what to do. A part of me wanted to just block him, move on, and keep my peace. But another part of me, the stronger part, knew that letting people like him go unchecked is exactly why they feel invincible. They think they can say whatever they want, hurt whoever they want, and face no consequences. So I did something I'd never imagined myself doing. I reported him. I didn't make up lies. I didn't exaggerate. I just told the truth. I sent screenshots to his employer with a brief message. This is one of your staff members posting homophobic and hateful content on public social media. I didn't expect much. Maybe a slap on the wrist. Maybe a conversation in some office that he'd laugh about afterward. But what happened next? I wasn't prepared for. When I hit send on that report, I thought maybe I'd get a polite response back. Something along the lines of, "Thanks for letting us know. We'll handle it internally." And I did get a response. Quicker than I expected. A few days later, there was an official reply from the business. It was short, professional, and just vague enough to avoid pointing fingers. They wrote, "All members of the community are welcome in our business. We will be discussing social media etiquette with current staff to ensure that it aligns with our reputation of providing outstanding customer service." On the surface, it sounded like the kind of boilerplate PR you'd expect from any company trying to sweep a mess under the rug. But what struck me was that this wasn't a generic auto response. This was written after someone higher up had seen the screenshots. And then I noticed something strange. Daniel's post stopped. No updates, no memes, no edgy jokes. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe he'd just gotten spooked. Maybe someone from work had pulled him aside and told him to shut it down. But then, a week later, his account lit up again. And this time, it wasn't him posting. It was other people. Friends, family members, people who knew him offline. They were commenting on his old posts, leaving angry emojis, sarcastic remarks, and things like, "Wow, all that work down the drain? Could have just kept your mouth shut. Hope it was worth it." Man, it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Daniel had been fired. 10 years with that company, gone. He was one of their few full-time employees, and just like that, they'd cut him loose. The kicker? I didn't even have to provide proof. Apparently, his manager had been on his friend list the entire time, but had him muted or hidden. They never saw the bile he was spewing until I put it in front of them. Once they looked, it wasn't even a debate. He had hung himself with his own words. And then came the personal fallout. Daniel had in-laws in law enforcement. The kind of people who, in his mind, gave him a shield of invincibility. He used to brag about it back in school, how he'd never get in trouble because he had family on the force. But none of that mattered now. They couldn't stop him from losing his job, and from the whispers online, it seemed like even they were embarrassed to be associated with him. The irony was thick. Here was a man who had built his entire adult life around this job, a decade of experience, seniority, stability, and he threw it all away with a few posts on Facebook. Posts that he thought would earn him laughs, likes, and validation. Instead, they cost him everything. And me? I wasn't celebrating. Honestly, I didn't want him fired. That wasn't my goal. All I wanted was acknowledgement, an apology, some shred of human decency from him to say, I get it. What I said was wrong. I hurt people. But even when confronted directly, he couldn't do it. He doubled down. He sneered. He acted like the victim. So when the hammer fell, I felt conflicted. On one hand, justice had been served. His words had consequences. For once, he wasn't shielded by laughter, by silence, or by people too afraid to call him out. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the thought. What if he had just apologized? What if he had chosen humility instead of pride? He could have kept his job, his reputation, his so-called stability. Instead, he let his hate define him. The comments under his last post were a funeral for his career. Friends dropping half-hearted condolences, strangers gloating. Former classmates, some who remembered his cruelty as vividly as I did, leaving sarcastic remarks like, "Guess karma finally caught up. Not so funny now, huh?" The silence from him was deafening. For a man who always had something to say, suddenly, there was nothing. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't last. And I had no idea just how loud his next move was going to be. Daniel finally broke his silence. It wasn't with an apology. It wasn't with reflection or humility. No, that would have been far too human for him. Instead, he came back with rage. The first post after his firing was a long, rambling rant. He called it cancel culture. He blamed snowflakes for being too sensitive. He painted himself as a martyr, someone who had been persecuted for just telling jokes. What stood out most to me wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't. Not once did he acknowledge the harm of his words. Not once did he admit that what he posted was hateful. Instead, it was all finger-pointing, all self-pity. The comments section didn't go how he wanted. A few of his old drinking buddies chimed in with the predictable, "Don't worry, bro, you'll bounce back." But most people weren't buying it. Former coworkers showed up, some politely, some brutally honest. "Dude, you've been warned before. Don't act surprised. This wasn't a joke, it was hate. Own it. You embarrassed all of us. Be glad you were only fired." I'll admit, reading those comments felt cathartic. For once, the spotlight wasn't protecting him, it was exposing him. But Daniel wasn't done. A week later, he started messaging people directly. He slid into DMs, accusing anyone who had ever disagreed with him of being the reason he got fired. Some of my old classmates even reached out to me, showing me screenshots of him lashing out. He was desperate to find someone to blame. One of my friends, who had also been one of his targets back in high school, sent me a message that said, "He actually tried to guilt-trip me into writing a character reference for him." Can you believe that? After all the crap he used to say to me? It was laughable, really. Daniel, the self-proclaimed tough guy, reduced to begging people he once mocked for help. But instead of sympathy, he only stirred up more resentment. Then came the final desperate move. He posted publicly again, this time revealing way too much information. He admitted he had applied to 5 different places and had been rejected by all of them. He ranted about how the system is rigged, how people won't let me move on, and how this one mistake is ruining my life. But here's the thing, it wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern. A history. Years of spewing hate, unchecked, until it finally caught up to him. And yet he still couldn't see it. What shocked me most wasn't his blindness. It was how quickly people around him began to distance themselves. One by one, his friends stopped commenting. Some unfriended him entirely. Even his own family grew quiet. Rumor had it his father-in-law, the one in law enforcement, had told him point blank, "You embarrassed us. Don't drag us into your mess." It was the beginning of a downward spiral. Daniel thought he could scream his way back into relevance, that he could intimidate or guilt people into standing by him. But the more he yelled, the more isolated he became. And for the first time, I realized something. I hadn't ruined his life. He had. All I did was shine a light on the truth, but Daniel wasn't ready to accept that. He was about to take things to a level I never expected, one that would drag me right back into the center of his chaos. For a while, after Daniel's online meltdown and public firing, I thought his chapter in my life was closed. I told myself that people like him burn out eventually, that his downfall was punishment enough. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Months later, I received a message. It was from Daniel. At first, I ignored it. Why would I ever respond? But the tone of the message wasn't like his usual arrogant self. It wasn't full of insults or excuses. It was soft. Almost broken. He wrote, "Romessa, I know I've done wrong. I've lost everything. I'm trying to change. Please just hear me out. I should have blocked him. I should have laughed and deleted it. But against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that small, naive part of me that still wanted to believe people could change. When we met, he was unrecognizable. Not in appearance, but in demeanor. The cocky smirk was gone. He looked tired, nervous, even desperate. He admitted his mistakes, or at least some of them. He said losing his job was a wake-up call. He said he wanted to build a better life, and I believed him. Over the weeks that followed, he inserted himself into my life with precision. He sent good morning texts, asked about my day, listened when I talked. He showed up when I needed help, offered support when I was down. Slowly, I began to think maybe he had really changed. It wasn't long before things escalated. Dinner dates, weekend trips. Then one evening under a string of cheap cafe lights, he asked me to marry him. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the part of me that remembered his apology, the soft-spoken words, the new attentiveness, won. I said yes. The wedding was small, quiet, almost rushed. No extravagant celebration, just a handful of family and acquaintances. For a brief moment, I convinced myself this was redemption. For him, for us, for the past. But masks don't last forever. Within weeks, the cracks began to show. First, the jokes returned. Small jabs at my expense disguised as humor. Then came the secrecy. Late nights out, phone calls cut short when I entered the room. Messages deleted before I could glance at his screen. I brushed it off at first. But then I found proof. Texts to other women. Pictures that made my stomach drop. Excuses that fell apart under the simplest questions. When I confronted him, he laughed in my face. "Relax, Romessa. You're overreacting. Everyone flirts. It doesn't mean anything." But it wasn't just infidelity. It was financial lies too. Bills left unpaid. Money disappearing from our joint account. Half-truths about investments that didn't exist. And then came the worst revelation of all. One night, after too much to drink, Daniel slipped. He bragged. He said marrying me was his comeback plan, that he had chosen me not out of love, but because I was respectable and would make him look like a man who had reformed. He admitted that his apologies had been rehearsed, his kindness a performance, his love nothing more than a weapon to restore his reputation. I remember staring at him as the truth sank in. My marriage wasn't built on second chances. It was built on manipulation. I wasn't his partner. I was his prop. And that was the night something inside me hardened. Because if he thought I was going to let him use me, humiliate me, and laugh at my expense, he had no idea who he was really married to. That was the night I began planning his downfall. I remember the night everything finally snapped into focus. Daniel had just come home, reeking of alcohol, his words slurred but his arrogance sharp as ever. He laughed at me for confronting him about his late nights. He said, "You should be grateful I chose you. Nobody else would have married you." In that moment, whatever sympathy or softness I once held for him evaporated. I realized then, he hadn't just married me for companionship. He had married me for convenience, for an image, for the illusion that he was settling down after his so-called mistakes. To him, I wasn't a partner. I was a prop. But props can become weapons, so I started planning. Quietly. Patiently. The first step was gathering proof. Screenshots of his late-night messages to other women. Bank statements that showed money funneled into shady accounts. Voice recordings of his drunken rants, where he slipped and admitted things he'd never say sober. The second step was making connections. I reached out to people he had wronged. Old co-workers, former friends, even classmates who still remembered his cruelty. Turns out I wasn't the only one who had stories. Together, we built a picture of the man behind the mask. And the third step? Timing. Daniel thrived on appearances. He loved being seen as the man who had rebuilt his life. So I chose the perfect stage to tear it all down. A family gathering. With his in-laws present, the ones in law enforcement, the ones whose respect he so desperately clung to. When the moment came, I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I simply laid everything bare. I handed his father-in-law a neatly organized folder. Proof of his infidelity, his lies, his finances, his hateful messages. I played a recording of him mocking their entire family, bragging about how he had fooled everyone into thinking he changed. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. His in-laws looked at him with disgust. His parents hung their heads. His so-called friends slipped out of the room one by one. And Daniel? For once, he had nothing to say. The fallout was immediate. Our marriage, crumbled in days. Divorce papers filed, assets divided, his reputation scorched beyond repair. His in-laws cut him off completely, embarrassed to be connected to him. The few friends he had left finally abandoned him, and me? I walked away with my head high, my proof in hand, and my freedom intact. Daniel's spiral only accelerated from there. Job rejections piled up. His social media became a wasteland of self-pity posts no one bothered to engage with. He went from being the loudest voice in the room to the man everyone avoided. He once told me in high school that he'd always be on top, no matter what. Now he was living proof that arrogance and hate are a fast track to rock bottom. As for me, I rebuilt, slowly, carefully, with people who saw me for who I was, not as a prop or a shield. And in the quiet of my new life, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Did I set out to destroy him? No. But when he chose lies, manipulation, and hate, he destroyed himself. All I did was make sure the world finally saw him for who he truly was. And that, to me, is the sweetest kind of revenge.